Hello, and welcome to Breakfast All Day, special holiday Monday edition. I'm Matt here with Christy and Alonso. They're going to talk to you about this new Bee Gees documentary. Well, maybe not new, it's a couple weeks old. I haven't been able to see it yet, but they have, and they'll tell you all about it. Christy, will you describe the movie, please?
I will. It's called The Bee Gees. How Can You Mend a Broken Heart? And Matt, you would love it because you love music so much. So I do hope that you'll get the opportunity to catch up with it at some point. It's directed by Frank Marshall, veteran director, producer Frank Marshall. And it's, in a lot of ways, the very traditionally structured music biopic, or music documentary rather. Yeah, about, a band and their origins and the highs and the lows and the drugs and the fights and the separation and the getting back together and it's all of that. It certainly is very, old fashioned and kind of safe in its structure, but like the music is so great and the interviews are so revelatory and there's so much archival footage and stuff from the studios, because the Bee Gees, the brothers, Barry, Morris, and Robin, were performing from their earliest days. And so there's so much footage of them from when they were kids, from when they were coming up, and the various styles of music that they performed in the 60s. And then, of course, the huge splash that was Saturday Night Fever, which defined the disco era, which they loathed being categorized as disco. But it gets its arms around a lot, not just like, oh my God, look at the hair and look at the clothes. It's like, it's about why they mattered culturally. It's about the evolution of music. It's about the evolution of their sound. And there are so many great stories that illuminate, how things happened that are now just essential parts of, pop culture and of music and, including how it is that Bee Gees songs got onto the Saturday Night Fever soundtrack and how it is that Barry Gibb discovered that falsetto. And because that wasn't necessarily a sound, in their toolbox before, and just out of sheer necessity that came about. And so I loved it. I mean, I'm old enough, as you guys all are, that we grew up with this music, and it's definitely the Saturday Night Fever incarnation of the Bee Gees. And as we also know, because they lived their lives publicly, that, they had troubles and divorces and breakups with each other. And Barry Gibb, the eldest one of all, is the only one left. And the ending of it, what he says at the very end of it, is very sad.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a lot that's fascinating here. I mean, they're interesting, and they were famous during a really cool period of pop music. And I think I'd learned at some point, but then I'd forgotten that they accidentally invented the drum loop.
That's a fascinating story. I love that story.
While making Saturday Night Fever just like out of necessity, and then it just it wound up being the perfect thing. There were moments where I was like, oh, these approved documentaries, there's always some point where they're not giving me a thing I need. Like, we find out that Robin and Barry like would clash a lot, and like Robin at one point broke up the act in the early 70s, then they got back together, and then after things happened later, they broke up again, and it's kind of like, but over what exactly? Like, I never felt like I got a satisfactory answer to what exactly was driving. Was it just ego? Were there other issues? Like, they seem to kind of skim on that.
It's just like a brotherly competition is what I would guess with that, right?
Sure, I guess, but I don't know. I came away from feeling not having that answer. Did you think that was covered?
I felt okay with that. Yeah, I mean, I assumed it was just like brothers fight over everything, and even though they're superstars and multi-millionaires, that thing, I mean, and I'm an only child, so I don't totally get it the way you guys probably do, but like that thing that defined you from childhood is still there no matter who you are. One thing that's so cool about this movie is that they ask other people to shine a light on why they mattered from their own perspectives. And so you have Justin Timberlake talking about the blue-eyed soul part of them, but then I loved Nick Jonas talking about that brother dynamic. And that's something that nobody but you in that thing can possibly understand. So that's why I assumed that.
And one of the
happened.
Oasis guys too. I thought that was a funny choice.
Yeah, there's not that I've seen the film, but like there's a thing that with siblings, with people that you don't grow up with, there's a whole dance before you like of escalation before you start fighting with someone, right? Whereas with siblings, like you've done that escalation so many times, it's like, fuck it, let gloves immediately come off, right?
Right.
And then magnify that by being a touring band. And I can only imagine like that kind of stuff. The other thing that I find fascinating, I don't know how much the movie covers this, is that I've read other people talk about there is nobody who harmonizes in close harmony like siblings.
The way
do.
brother, yeah, and Nick Jonas talks about that, how you can't like fake that. Here's my giant problem with this movie, and I think it's absolutely there. They skip the Sgt. Pepper movie. And that might seem like a small detail, but it's not for various reasons. Okay. First of all, it was a high-profile fiasco. Like the album sold really well and had hit songs, but the movie was an embarrassment, and they were front and center, the co-stars of that movie with Peter Frampton. That movie happened late in the game in terms of just when the whole disco backlash was happening. So I think when the movie I think one of the best things this movie does is really analyzes where the whole disco sucks movement was coming from, who was behind it, why it was basically like petrified straight white guys who couldn't dance, who were lashing out at a thing that gay people and women and people of color liked, and so I thought all that was handled really brilliantly. But I think because there's a big chunk of the movie that's about how the disco sucks movement made the Bee Gees become like a laughingstock or has-beens or nobody cared anymore, I think the Sgt. Pepper movie plays a huge part of that. And then finally, the Beatles themselves were such a huge influence to the Bee Gees. They talk about wanting to be like the Beatles and doing songs like the Beatles. They appealed to Brian Epstein to become their manager, and he pushed them off onto Robert Stigwood, who was the guy who shaped their careers and produced the Sgt. Pepper movie. Like all these threads come back to that moment, and I think it's to not mention it at all in this documentary is like leaving out, I don't know, like it's like when we watched Fosse Verdon and they didn't even talk about Star 80. It's like he made 5 movies. You can't just skip one,
I totally spaced that there was a Sgt. Pepper movie at all.
Oh, I saw it in theaters.
I mean, I'm a little younger than you, so that was not as formative to me, but that's a good point that you make. I had forgotten about it entirely, but didn't feel like my enjoyment of it suffered as a result, but apparently yours did.
Just because I remember at the time, like before it came out, it was so hyped. It was like, this was, Stigwood was going to make another Saturday Night Fever in terms of like hit movie, hit soundtrack. It was lab designed to be that. And it was a crushing disaster. Like, I don't even know if I want to say you should watch it sometime because it's so bad.
I feel like I have, but I was too young to get it.
Yeah, but the soundtrack album is pretty great.
We should review it.
There are some great Beatles covers on the album for sure. Like Earth, Wind and Fire's "Got to Get You Into My Life" is like, there are people who say that Aerosmith's "Come Together" is better than the Beatles, and I'm not going to fight them on it. But anyway, that to me felt like, okay, Barry, I know you're still smarting about that, but it's been 40 years. Like, let's talk about it.
Is that what that's about? You think because he is a voice in it that he got to decide, okay, I'm not talking about this?
I think so. Yeah. I mean, I think so many of these docs that we see now that are about like living legends, whether they be political or entertainment or whatever else, I think those folks have a lot of sway over. Maybe they don't get final cut, but I think they get to dictate a lot of like, I don't want to talk about that. We're not going to cover that. I think a lot of that stuff gets ironed out before the deal is even struck that they agree to participate. So whenever I see movies like this, I always in the back of my mind, I'm like, what did they insist upon? Because sometimes, it's warts and all. I mean, like the John Lewis doc included the part about how like, he totally shivved Andrew Young in that election where they were against each other, where he brings up the drug arrest or whatever. But I think other times in these movies, you can tell when the subject has some say and like, let's not go into that,
The thing though, and that's a good point about the omission of that, but this isn't a totally like celebratory movie.
Oh no!
About the Bee Gees.
There are some warts for sure. I'll give him credit for that.
And so much hair, so much glorious hair.
hair.
And there's Andy Gibb too. The whole tragedy of like Andy Gibb trying to hang out with them, and he could have been as big of a star as they were. I loved Andy Gibb when I was.
He was the
he
shit.
was beautiful.
Yeah.
So
No, because Andy Gibb was sort of the apotheosis in terms of like he was the hot one of the four of them and had the voice. So like he could have, I think, gone even further than them, but tragically his substance abuse issues led to an early death. Although later than I thought. Like the movie reminds me, it's like it was in the late 80s. I thought he had died earlier than that.
Yeah, they do a really good job. You mentioned it briefly earlier about explaining the whole death to disco thing, and they do a beautiful job about 2/3 of the way in of cross-cutting between the disco demolition night at it's Comiskey Stadium, right?
Comiskey Park, yeah.
And then they're playing a concert at Oakland Coliseum, and it's packed and it's sold out, and they're like at the peak of their Saturday Night Fever fame and acclaim and popularity, and they do a really smooth job of cross-cutting between those two things and establishing that as like a pivotal point of change. So
I remember getting the Spirits Having Flown album for my birthday that year. That they were huge at that point.
Did you guys like the Bee Gees growing up?
Oh yeah, I had older siblings, so we had the Saturday Night Fever album, and like believe me, in 6th grade, I could disco like nobody's business.
I'm not surprised to hear that.
Yeah, I did, but was afraid to admit it because in Kansas City, you liked rock or you sucked. And I liked disco more because it was, in a lot of cases, better music in a lot of ways. I look back on it and realize like, shit, like there's so much of that that's so symphonic. Like you've got these huge arrangements that they drop strings into, and it's not
all
just
the Giorgio
Bee Gees,
Moroder stuff and the South Soul Orchestra. Yeah.
Right. It's just, you get into that stuff. It's just amazing. It really is, it's like taking funk music and then letting a whole orchestra have at it. And it's fascinating to dig into.
And it's been re-embraced. I mean, really constantly. Ever since disco died, it's always been revived in one way or another. But like Daft Punk did a whole album with Giorgio Moroder a couple of years ago. So it is, it was great. It is great. And although again, as this documentary points out really shrewdly, the popularity of disco spawned a lot of shit. And the shit is what made people hate it.
Disco Duck is terrible.
There's a lot of garbage, but
the whole Mickey Mouse disco album,
but you can see although Sesame Street Fever. That was awesome. I think I still have that record. But then house music comes along and kind of like breathes new life into disco, because you have all these kids that are growing up on house music and finding that out and then realizing, oh, disco's all at that same beats per minute. I can mix that in. Awesome.
Yeah. House and EDM. It's just like we basically come up with new ways to say it's disco, but it's disco.
Right.
And they were so miffed and pissy, the Bee Gees were, about not wanting to be labeled as disco. Like they defined this sound, but they wouldn't want that categorization.
At that point in history, I wouldn't want to be slugged with that either. I mean, that's what got you taken off radio. That's what got them taken off radio.
The Stones did disco songs. Come on.
Yeah, but what's cool about this documentary is also, and I know we're taking forever with this, is that the whole sort of the next act of their careers, which is like, okay, you don't want to see us anymore. We're going to write songs for everybody else.
Yeah.
And then they had all these hits with that, like Barbra Streisand sang, or that Dionne Warwick sang, or that, whoever else. And and they have that sound to them still, and that kind of production and everything. But yeah, they sort of like, all right, we're going to be off stage over here doing our thing, and she's going to sing it and you're going to buy it and it'll be great.
Emotion by Samantha Sang.
For instance, a great song.
All those Barbra Streisand songs totally remind me of Carpool when I was a little girl, when I was like 6, 7 years old.
I didn't know they wrote Chain Reaction for Diana Ross. That's a great one.
And they wrote Heartbreaker for Dionne Warwick.
Mm-hmm.
That is a darn catchy little song.
Oh, so good.
Anyway, so I like this a lot. I'm giving it a 9. It's very entertaining.
I gave it a 7.3. I think it is it never lags, certainly, and I learned some things that were cool, but I'm just really pissed about that Sergeant Pepper thing because again, it's not just me being anal retentive. I think it plays into a lot of other stuff. So
okay. Our number is an 8.2. This movie's been out for a little while now, so I'm really happy that we're catching up with it, but is available on HBO Max, I want to say.
Yes, that is correct. Yeah, so check it out, and thanks for checking us out. Like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us at BeFastAllDay on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook, and visit our Patreon page at patreon.com/BeFastAllDay. We're talking about Bridgerton, we're talking about WandaVision, and we are very close to knowing what our January off the menu is, which is a classic film that we'll be reviewing. So much going on over there. Become one of our subscribers if you have already. Awesome. Thank you. And until next time, bye.